There we go. Okay, so this is the beginning. This is the first episode of Otto's Liberty Hour, new podcast by Otto Leonard Wright. Today we will be going over a few topics, namely an event that happened just the other day when a um, treasonous fascist joined our little simulation and decided to espouse his stupid and moronic ideals that no one in a million years would ever logically follow, um, because it's been proven to suck entirely. So, basically, what is fascism? Fascism isn't, well, here, let me get the Google definition, since they say it perfectly. Definition of fascism. Here we go. This is fascism. Fascism is a form of far-right authoritarian ultranationalism characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and strong regimentation of society and of the economy, which came to prominence in the early 20th century. Notable figures of fascism are people such as Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, and can also be attributed to um, Philip Pétain of France and Francisco Franco. Uh, Notable events that took place underneath fascist regimes uh, can be seen with the Holocaust, which the Germans per- perpetrated against the 6 million Jews of Europe. That number could have been a lot larger had the Germans somehow won the Second World War. But thanks to their horrible ideology, they lost very, very well, very slowly, since it took about 6 years from the beginning of the war to the end of the war for them to actually die, but still, very good. Now, another ideology that everyone should also hate is communism. Communism is basically the reverse of fascism, but still very authoritarian, totalitarian, and bad. Communism usually tries to espouse being for the people, always looking to do what's right for the majority, but usually it doesn't turn out that way. Usually, a small minority gain power and force the population of their country to maintain a communist regime. This can be seen with the Soviet Union with the NKVD, and then the KGB, the successor organization to the NKVD, which were secret police organizations that kept the people in line. For the longest time, especially in the Soviet Union, you would see the NKVD and later the KGB be given quotas to meet, and if they did not meet them, the agents would I don't really know how far they'd go, but I would assume they'd either be removed from existence, killed, or removed from their office, something like that. But you never really know with despotic regimes like that. You could be executed for sneezing in an inappropriate manner. But back to um, back to the topic of fascism and the wonderful gentleman we had on yesterday. If you had heard my rant on this insane individual who somehow believed that fascism was good, he was from Kentucky. He was a racist and a separationist, quote unquote separationist, uh, who was also, I would assume, anti-Semitic and claimed to not like Hitler at all. But it was clear that he loved Mussolini and thought that fascist Italy was amazing, even though fascist Italy was quite incompetent, filled with terrible leaders such as Mussolini himself, who had no idea what he was doing. Um, Examples of his terrible leadership can be seen with entering the Second World War, aiding the Germans, even though his country was nowhere near prepared for war with any country whatsoever. And the only reason Italy won a war against the Ethiopians, which they had partially occupied in 1935 and then fully annexed in 1936, was thanks to superior technology and the use of chemical weapons against inferior forces of troops. Um, Also, thanks to a lack of a unified League of Nations, which didn't seem to care at all about fascist expansion throughout Europe from the 1930s and onwards until um, Hitler declared war on Poland and the Germans began their aggressive campaign of terror and hate against the peoples of Europe. Um, Another good example of oppression by fascist regimes could be seen with Augusto Pinochet and Francisco Franco. Pinochet was noted for throwing communists out of helicopters, and while I think that's extremely based, it's um, still pretty oppressive and not really that good. Though I could completely understand if they were militant communists, because you don't want militant communists anywhere near your country because they are disgusting people. A good example of a militant communist was Leon Trotsky, who believed in a permanent revolution. People like that are not based and should certainly be allowed nowhere near the hall of politics in your country. But neither should fascists, of course. Um, Though in countries such as the United States, which I am proud to call my home, we have a wonderful uh, piece of uh, piece of parchment that gives us rights, and we wouldn't have that without the help of a group, a specific group of our founding fathers who had the Bill of Rights made, which confirms, which the the first 10 amendments, can make up the Bill of Rights and secure our freedom of speech, freedom of religion, uh, right to own, right to bear arms, et cetera, et cetera. Um, a very good example of a fascist, well, a few good examples of fascist regimes trying to curtail individual rights is with Mussolini and Italy. Um, the moment, well, I guess the moments after Mussolini seized power, after being invited to Rome by King Victor Emmanuel II of Italy, he was made prime minister. And the fascists, what they like to do is they like to denote some kind of they like to give off a sign of strength in their regime. Uh, and what Mussolini did, he used his quote unquote march on Rome uh, as a huge piece of propaganda to get the Italian people on his side because he took a train. He didn't take part in that march at all. His followers did. Um, he took a train and he arrived days before his followers. And once they all finally arrived, he was proclaimed prime minister by the king and formed a government, of course, being fascist. Um, Now, of course, with fascist leaders, you generally get um, they're generally okay in terms of leadership. Even communists can sometimes be okay, but overall, they will more likely than not will lead your country to war and devastation, like with the Nazis and the Italians, because Mussolini knew full well that Italy was not ready for a war. He knew full well that his people would not be able to sustain a conflict. He knew full well that he did not have the arms and munitions to keep up a protracted war. But he sided with Hitler um, anyways, and attempted to fight the British and French, which he failed miserably in doing. He pretty much lost. Well, the Germans had their hand in Africa as well with the Africa Corps, or almost Africa Corps, and then the Italians in East Africa. I don't know much about the Italian East African campaign, but certainly an interesting venture for both the British, the Italians, and the Germans. Um, but then you also have um, other failings. Mussolini uh, certainly contributed to, and Hitler did as well. Hitler, instead of centralizing government, decentralized it and made absolute and made um, well, he there was a philosophy used in the Third Reich known as the Führerprinzip, which was the idea that no matter what you were doing, as long as you uh, did something in the name of the will of the leader, Hitler or whatever, you were doing good. And that was completely terrible because you had all these different people in different offices drawing up orders for roughly the same things, such as when Goering, Himmler, and some other Nazi drew up plans for the final solution to the Jewish question. And then they all came up with different ideas. And the one that was chosen, I believe, was drawn up by Himmler was the final solution that we know of today, which was the total elimination of all Jews of Europe, um, which is not good, obviously. Um, it started around 1942, 1943, and from then on went on to kill over 6 million Jews throughout Europe, and would have gone on to kill much more had the Germans not been stopped by the victorious Allied powers. it's a it's a real shame when you actually get into the nitty-gritty details of just how evil these people were, and how people can still believe in these ideologies. Because as I have mentioned a few times already, there was a gentleman yesterday who was espousing these ideas that we should have a fascist American state, how America is a Christian nation, how Christianity should be the main religion, etc., etc. And that's just it's very depressing that someone like that was born in this country that was founded on the ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for every individual, so long as they, of course, be legal um, pursuits. And if I were to be given the option of total elimination of all radicals, I would certainly uh, pursue that because they're all a drain on society. They like to promote themselves as being very nationalistic, but in America, you don't get to do that. You don't get to be a far righty or a far lefty without coming off as an utter moron. Internationalism is bad for the United States. Nationalism is bad for the United States. Patriotism, what this country was founded on, that is good for the United States. We should be open, certainly, towards other countries, but we should not be open, openly hostile unless someone coming into the United States is trying to hurt our people or hurt ourselves. We should defend our rights. We should defend our country. We should defend our democracy. We should not sit idly by and let these fascists and let these communists try and muck about our democracy and change it to their awful ideals that have been proven to not work 100% of the time. These ideas have failed. Why are people still pursuing them? I don't know. Why are people still idealists? I don't know. But these people have no amount of reason in their brains, have no sense whatsoever, and should not be trusted in any position of government whatsoever because they would seek the total destruction of our republic that our forefathers fought so hard to preserve in the Civil War, in the Revolutionary War, the First World War, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, and more recently, Desert Storm and the War on Terror. People will always hold different views, and that's fine. But when you hold views that would completely destroy a country such as the United States, where you are allowed to hold your obviously idiotic and obviously moronic views, then you should just not be allowed to take part in our democratic process. If you would seek to destroy our democratic process, you should not be able to take part in our democratic process. If you would seek to destroy the very foundation this country was built upon, you should not be able to live in this country. You do not deserve the rights guaranteed to you by this country when you would take those rights away from others. That's utterly ridiculous. And the prospect of these fascists and these communists wanting to remove the rights from, let's say, more conservative members of society, like the Republicans or the Democrats, even they would claim that the Democrats aren't radical enough because they aren't. They're sensible people, despite mostly being comprised of liberals. Um, they would just seek the total destruction of democracy as we know it, and that cannot stand. That cannot. We no one should be forced to sit back and watch their country fall to the far right or the far left, because the far right and far left would sooner destroy the idea of the individual and the idea of free thought and the idea of free speech and the freedom to practice religion, because they have no concept of freedom. They have no concept of the Bill of Rights or the rights of man as we know them today. Moving on um, to a less somber topic, such as the possible destruction of the United States. You never know with the far right or far left. But I'd like to invite Mr. Henry Bell to speak if he's here. He can be my first guest.
Oh, hello. I'm very happy to be here.
Yes, hello. So, what are you? What you were here yesterday when when the fascist was trying to defend his views, weren't you?
Yes, I was.
What were your thought? What was your take on what he said?
I remember him talking a little bit about Mussolini, and how the Italian people loved Mussolini, which is obviously very false. Mussolini was very narcissistic, and one thing that he did is he paid people to name their children Benito or Benito Mussolini. What happened was when Mussolini fell out of power, a lot of those parents change their children's name, and a lot of people decided, I do not want to be associated with this person. I don't want to be called Benito Mussolini. So I think that um, what he was saying was not only built on false pretenses, but I think in and of itself, I think he was very ill informed about what fascists really are and the
Yes,
support fascists receives.
of course. Now, would you agree with the statement generally um the leaders such as Hitler and Mussolini did okay in terms of leadership, but not of course with their policy, but their leadership overall.
I think Hitler and Mussolini, you can't really put them in the same boat. They're different people who achieve power through different ways. Hitler achieved power through democracy, surprisingly enough, and Mussolini kind of achieved it through this power grab, like you were saying earlier.
Yes.
I would say that as far as effectiveness goes, as leadership, I think Hitler was a very lazy person.
Like,
And I don't think either of them were really effective leaders who knew how to progress their country forward. If they did, they would not have brought their countries into disastrous wars, i.e., World War II.
yes, certainly. So, what are your thoughts on individuals that didn't really take part in say offensive wars necessarily against other nations, but against their people, such as Francisco Franco, who raged a more internal conflict with the communists, and certainly fought in the Spanish Civil War. and Augusto Pinochet, who ran Chile as the military dictator for quite some time.
I think that if you are stupid enough to raise war against your own people, I think that that's very, very foolish. I think that uh, as a government, your job is to protect and defend your people. If that means that you are a more liberal leaning government, more conservative leaning government, to go after and cause a war against your people, I think that that shows not only depravity and idiocy, but I think it's very, very emblematic of what you should not do as a government, because as a government, your job is to protect the people, not to murder them.
Sure. Um, you can see cases like that, like I was talking about earlier with Mr. Pinochet. He had communists taken up in helicopters and dropped hundreds of feet from the air to the ground, um, just to have them killed. And then Mr. Francisco Franco, who was the Generalissimo of Spain for till his death in 1976 or 1973,
Yeah,
and
right.
he certainly had many a communist executed and deported, and that's pretty much what he did for quite some time. Which I don't like to say this, but makes sense due to the fact that if you have that many people who still disagree with your government and still want to take up arms against your government, you need to secure it as best as you can, when you can, at an opportune
Mhm.
time. So it is sad to say, but he did, in terms of um, stability, do an okay job, I suppose. But in terms of morality, he certainly didn't really let that go.
Yeah, I think that the U.S. has let these radicals. I think like in the past 30 years and starting in the 60s, kind of have more sway and have more power. Now, I don't necessarily think that they will get power. I don't want them to get power personally, but I think that an effort needs to be made, like what you're doing, is informing the American people against these radical ideologies, which uh, like lead to death, lead to silly wars, and just lead to suffering
Certainly,
unnecessarily.
of course. That's what that is what I'd like to do, since people apparently still think I'm a fascist myself. I am not a fascist. I'm clearly not a fascist. I would have not started this podcast, and I would certainly not have yelled at that moron yesterday for his terrible and evil beliefs, because he was a genuine fascist, he was a racist, he was an anti-Semite, and I do not agree with those ideas. I have never agreed with those ideas, and I would never unironically say that I agree with those ideas, or make any kind of remark showing my absolute 100% truthful support for fascism, for National Socialism.
Yeah, I think that um, going after the communist, the fascist, was right, and I also think that if you look at these modern day fascists, at these modern day people who idealize these dictatorships, I mean, I have correlations with communists, and they basically worship these murderers,
Exactly.
and it's cult like. It is really cult like how you see these people. Oh, Mao Zedong, so great, and so misinformed.
Yeah,
I've never debated a communist who hasn't had to edit the evidence or
exactly.
use deceptive research to get their points across.
Yes. And you will see with many communists and many fascists, flip they'll flip the narrative. They'll switch the narrative to say, "Oh, this Jewish person attacked this German person," or this fascist attacked the communists. That justified the communists retaliating. And then people, especially, like to justify German and Soviet war crimes, as uh. I don't know what people use to justify German war crimes against the Soviets, but people like to justify Soviet war crimes by saying, "Oh, the Germans did it first." Does
Yeah,
that
and
make
another
it
thing I see from those types of people is that they say, "Oh well, it improved. It wasn't as bad as you think, and the numbers were being da 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 da," and basically
right?
try to alter the facts to suit the
Exactly.
narrative. And another thing that they do, which I think is very slimy, is they say, "Oh, it improved that you would get time taken off of the gulags if you did something, if you
Yeah,
did good." And I'm like, it's still they were still starving people and beating
exactly.
people, forcing them to work in labor camps. That doesn't justify what they did. And one of the most bizarre things I heard was from this dude, and he said that. That the Soviet camps were like American prison system was like the American prison system. I was like, what?
I believe me and you both discussed with that gentleman, and he was absolutely insane and deranged in his ideas.
Oh
Comparing
yes, yeah,
comparing American internment camps to a concentration camp or a gulag, how they are nothing alike. No one starved in American internment camps. No one was
no,
gassed. No one
no,
was shot. No,
no.
it's
No.
ridiculous.
And
It's
and and, and another thing too is that I just really think and another thing that I hear is I people usually defend the gulags a lot more than they do the
concentration.
um the concentration camps because there's not a lot of attention on the gulags and not a lot of people know a lot about the gulags. But another thing I heard was that, oh, these people that were sent into the gulags, they were all people who committed crimes. I'm like, but you do know that people were just disappearing in Moscow and in these
No,
places, and you hear these
no,
stories from
they
survivors
were
that they
arrested.
go boom, they go disappear. Where
They
did they
were
go?
committing crimes, and you know what they considered a crime? Having
Yeah.
any opinion that was different from Stalin's. That's what they
Yes,
considered a
absolutely.
crime. Anyone who thought slightly differently from what Stalin thought disappeared. Anyone who
Yeah.
had any kind of opinion besides besides what Stalin believed was right, what the state believed was right, you would disappear. You'd be sent to the gulag, and that was a crime. They treated that
That was
as a crime. That is what totalitarian states do. They treat having your own opinion as a crime. Anything you
yes.
say against the leader, against the state, against the party, against the military, what have you, will be treated as a crime. That's what you see with Nazi Germany. That's what you see with fascist Italy. That's what you saw with fascist Spain. That's what you saw with the Soviet Union. That's what you see with communist China. And you still have things like that happening today in Russia. They have arrested their political opposition's leader, and they're probably going to kill him. You don't know. He's been arrested. He's probably in some Russian black site. They're probably going to have him shot if they haven't already.
Yeah,
What?
and this is the thing that people glorify these dictatorships, and they really are misinformed. And I think especially with communists, it is. I think, and I personally believe this, and I said it to this person who I was debating, and he was on the server for some time until we told him knock it off. It's not cool. Um, that and I believe this, that they get indoctrinated in the school system, that the school system is teaching these children, oh, communism, free things, everyone fair, and they teach this to children, and especially in colleges, which I think you get paid to be indoctrinated in colleges. You get a bunch of useless student loan debt from it, but they're teaching this to children and to people who have no idea how the world works, and they're teaching them these communist ideas, and it's really destructive.
Yes, most certainly. I've heard a lot about college professors who are extremely young and should not be on the job, or just extremely old and seem to have some kind of Alzheimer's or dementia because they go on about how um, how great communism is or how great socialism is, and it's ridiculous because but socialism and communism do not work on their own economically. They have to have some kind of capitalist policy with working with them to actually work. You saw this with the Soviet Union. They were doing extremely terribly in the latter half of their existence, 1989 and 1991, before they collapsed, of course. And then you saw they had to make economic reforms because otherwise they wouldn't
They go
uh,
bust.
they would have collapsed. I mean, they were gonna collapse anyways, but still, they would have like their whole economy would have just given up. And then you saw this with socialist China, or sorry, communist China, um, where they, Mao's glorious revolution that ended up in the
Uh,
millions and millions of deaths of Chinese civilians due to starvation because of his collectivization programs. Collectivization has been seen in not only China but in the former Soviet Union to have been worse than individual ownership of plots of land. It was
yes.
seen that when land was collectivized from the kulaks, which were a kind of wealthy planter class in Russia, um, it was seen that food production drastically dropped after that land was collectivized and ran by groups of peasants and all that working on the land.
And these quote unquote American socialists, they could not live a day in communist Russia. That's one thing I always advocate for. Is I'm like, hey, you're socialist. You think the system is so great. Why don't you go to China and live there for a couple of months, then come back here? You think fascism is so great. Why don't you go to a fascist state, live there, come back? These people, they live in absolute luxury compared to what the average socialist wants. There's no McDonald's in socialism. There is no iPhone in socialism. There's no Twitter in socialism. There's no YouTube in socialism. The only thing it is you become a human machine and you work, work, and work while you're starving, while you're dying for this government. And I mean, you look at the leaders. Look at Kim Jong Un. Kim Jong Un probably weighs the size of three average North Koreans.
Exactly.
The,
And their
the
and
food
their
situation is so bad.
collectivized programs don't allow them to grow much more food than they could be doing right now. They have a bunch of rice fields barely growing rice. They have famine all the time. They have barely enough food to maintain their population. It's ridiculous.
They're living in like the Middle Ages. That's really what socialism is. It's like the Middle Ages, where you have the rich nobles who own these vast plots of land, who work for the government, and you see these rich nobles, in this case Kim Jong Un, his fans, and the people in Pyongyang get everything they want. They get the nice food, they get the nice clothes, they get whatever, and everyone else is toiling for these rich people, and that's exactly what's happening in North Korea.
Yes, and it's all these people who promote socialism and communism fail to realize that they are constantly benefiting from a capitalist economic system or a largely capitalist economic system. And it's very ironic and very ridiculous. The only few socialist policies America has is, of course, welfare, Social Security, and I believe some government-owned healthcare, uh, what are they referred to as? Healthcare providers, I guess, is the proper term. But yeah,
And
Medicare.
and, and that is true that America has really become the wealthiest country. And I think that America has been capitalistic for an incredibly long time. And I think that showed that America has grown economically. And if you look at the powerhouse 200 years ago, that was Great Britain. And that was under a monarchy, but basically it was kind of like us. But it shifted after the wars and stuff, where America became this powerhouse. And America has become a beacon of hope and freedom. And America produces more millionaires than any other country in the world. And you wonder why? Is because there's so much opportunity. In socialism, in communism, you don't have opportunity. You don't have a choice. You don't live a life. You become, like I said, a robot for the state. You become a puppet and tool of the state.
Exactly. Your life from the moment you wake up in the morning, from the till the moment you lay your head down to go to sleep, is ran by the state.
Yes.
And we
Absolutely.
cannot allow these people to try and corrupt our ideals as a free society. Our republic has gone on nearly 300 years now.
Yes.
2076 is just a few decades away. It's we cannot allow these people to corrupt our ideals because we are coming on the we are on the cusp of our nation's 300-year anniversary.
And it would be a shame if we were living at gaunt, starving figures and communes while the rich people in DC got everything.
Exactly. Or what have or the or the commune of DC was getting everything while the people of uh and, and it's just, oh god, it's so hard to comprehend how people can
Believe
have
that.
any kind of believe anything like that. Fascism, communism, whatever, they're all terrible ideologies, and they will never amount to anything ever in the United States or in any other free country.
And another thing that I'd like to point out in my time here is you look at the Democrat cities. You look at Portland. You look at San Francisco. You look at New York City, and you see how people are living there. That is what socialism will bring this country. Is that you will have this very rich upper crust of society, and you will have a bunch of poor people. And you see it in these cities. These high crime rates. This anarchy like way of going around things that's what socialism and communism brings is there will be a very few rich elite in this country, and there will be a bunch of crimes, which there are a lot of crimes in modern day North Korea, and a lot of poverty. And that's what you will be seeing if you want to go down the road of socialism, and you're seeing that in these socialistic like cities.
Exactly. All right. Thank you for coming on today, Mr. Bell. I appreciate you and you taking the time to join me.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you very much. Um, moving on to our next topic to divert a little bit away from politics is oh, okay, we have another guest actually. My apologies. Mr. Henry Shloyo will be joining me. Hello, Mr.
Hi there.
Shloyo. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good.
All right. Now, what did you have to discuss today?
I would just like to discuss a few of the things that were said by you and Mr. Bell previously.
Yes.
I wasn't paying complete attention for the entire thing. I got up and left to go pee once or twice, but one of the things that I did hear was that was I think was it you or Mr. Bell who said that so socialism and communism don't work themselves, which is true. Communism is a flawed ideology; it doesn't actually work itself. It's not good, you know.
Yeah.
However, the statement that kind of is a little misleading when you say that socialism on its own does not work and needs capitalism to hold it up. Obviously, I don't believe in the most like far left socialism humanly possible because that would just be a wee bit cringe and it wouldn't work in the majority of scenarios. However, also the inverse can also be the inverse can also be true where raw unfiltered like laissez-faire capitalism objectively doesn't work because it leads to the
Oh,
same
yeah.
like
Yeah.
totalitarianism oppression just by corporations, not by
Yeah.
like the government. You know.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree with that, and I agree that there should be some limitations, of course, to corporations. Corporations shouldn't be able to run amok and do as they please because the interests of the people should be put largely above the interests of corporations. But in some cases, corporations should have a say in some kind of government. Uh, but yeah, I see where you're coming from.
Yeah. Then that was the main the main grape I had. I'm sure that
Yeah,
there's something else, but not
yeah.
on hand though.
But yeah, that's fine. Well, thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate you taking the time to do that. Anyways, moving on. Actually, yeah, let's cover economics for a moment. That's just inspired me. Um, Mr. Schlo, you brought that up. So, overall, my personal view on economics is that for a good system to rely on is largely capitalistic one, of course, with socialist policy. There are certainly a few good socialist policies you can adopt into your capitalist into your country. such as universal health care. I'm a big proponent for that, especially in a country such as the United States, which can definitely afford it, and the people can certainly afford it too. But and you see that with countries in Scandinavia, such as Sweden, Denmark, Norway, I believe, all have universal health care, and so does Canada as well. But of course, they're Scandinavian, they're not American, they're not as diverse as the United States. But diversity in ethnicity and race doesn't really matter in terms of universal health care. Things like that really only depend on, I suppose, the location of clinics or hospitals or any other locations that provide medical services, and the ability of the government to provide said service. Now, obviously, as I've said, as we've broached upon the topic of the United States and how large its economy is, the United States is one of, if not the largest economy uh, on the earth. Um, So it could certainly afford to provide universal health care to the entire population of the United States. Um, Certainly not everyone should be able to get that, I suppose, since certain people that cannot pay taxes, of course, for such a amenity should not be allowed to use it, because when you're having all the folks that are paying for it having their money go to someone who hasn't paid a single dime, then obviously you come upon the moral issue of whether or not they deserve it. And personally, I don't believe a poor individual who has not been able to pay their dues, they should not be able to receive such a service. But once again, that's a moral and uh, subjective issue for the individual to think about. But overall, I think it's a very straightforward answer in terms of healthcare and all that, and then Social Security has certainly uh, helped a great deal of people, especially since the Great Depression. Mr. Roosevelt brought that into action and certainly saved a good deal of people from uh, the, I guess debt would be the proper word, since many people, after losing thousands, if not millions of dollars in some cases, at least in today's money, required financial aid, and Mr. Roosevelt helped them along their way and saved our country from the Great Depression. Uh, Moving on past politics and economics, I suppose I have a good recommendation. If anyone goes down to Florida, this will be the closing statement for my episode today. If you are ever in the area around Florida, a good few destinations to go are certainly Disneyland or Disney World in Florida, where I believe um, that is one that those two are both great parks. I've been there multiple occasions, and I would certainly suggest you hit those up eventually on your way uh, through Florida if you're ever making your way down south. And another great suggestion would be Fun Spot. I don't know if there are more outside of Florida, but that's the only one I know of. But that's another great little theme park I suggest you hit up at least once when you're in the state. So uh, this will be the end of my episode today. Thank you all for tuning in, and you guys have a fantastic rest of your day.